We've come really, really far. So it's been really exciting. And having said that, let's bring on up the panelists. Come on, you can all come on up.
Order here?
No, sit in any order you want to sit in. All right, good. All right, awesome. Okay, so the first question for our panelists is going to be, how and why did you get involved? Okay, so you're going to have to guess who our first one is from the picture. Who's that? All right, we're going to start with Cisco DeVries. Okay, Cisco. It's surprising to me. It looks as though you have blonde hair. I would not have thought that.
I did.
So if you could give us a little bit on how and why you got involved with the PACE movement, that would be awesome.
Thanks, Jeff. Before I say that, I'd say I can say this about a number of people in the room, but none more than Jeff, which is that I wouldn't be here. I don't think any of us would be here if it weren't for Jeff and for David and the work that went into this, but primarily going back, the belief that this was worth it, even when things were tough. It was easy to be part of something that was a new idea that everyone's kind of getting behind at a time of great excitement when the new president had taken office and this was part of what was going on. It's a lot harder to keep the faith when it looks like there's no reason to do so. So I don't know that I would have had it not been for those two gentlemen. So a big thank you to you and to David for that. The start for me started where I think a lot of people start with PACE today, which is I wanted solar on my house and I didn't have any money. I was the chief of staff to the mayor of Berkeley, and we had passed an ambitious greenhouse gas reduction proposal that we actually put before the voters. We had Al Gore come and speak to it. It was a very exciting time. We were committed to showing real progress and not just planning. And I thought, well, as the sort of lead policy person for the mayor doing this, I would walk the walk. I would walk the talk. I would put it on my house. And so I got bids, and lo and behold, it's very expensive to write a check for solar on your house. And this is back in the day where we had home equity lines of credit. So I actually had that option, and my wife and I had a conversation about the kitchen remodel that we were also thinking of doing and how the conflict between those two was pretty clear. And it became very clear that if we don't solve the financing gap, that the technology advancements in solar and efficiency and all of this money, it's a threshold issue, we can't do it. So for me, it really started with that, the bid that I got for solar on my house. And then you start, as a city guy, you start looking around for tools that you have to solve that problem. So I went through several of them. I looked at the utility bills that we had, PG&E bills. I looked at our garbage bill, which is something I know Babylon went down the road. It turns out in Berkeley you cannot use the garbage bill to pay for solar, just in case you wanted to check. I did that work. And I really got pulled into a totally different issue. We're trying to solve an underground utility district problem that was involved using a very old state law that allows you to finance, allows you to finance stuff and put it on your property tax bill. And all I really did was figure out that you could potentially use that same existing state law with a small amendment and do the solar, and do the energy efficiency. So it started with me wanting solar and figuring out when you're a local government and you look at the tools that you have, this is one that I came across, and it turns out it works. Big shout out to the folks at Chris Lynch and the folks at Jones Hall, who the bond counsel, who when I called them up didn't hang up on me, as I think most would have. So.
Thank you, Cisco. Now we're going to hear from. Well, this is Cisco's other baby, so we saw his baby picture, but that's the first, I guess, website page for the Berkeley First program, right?
The PACE baby.
The PACE baby.
This was the very first PACE program website.
Exactly.
It looked very slick, but really it was just me and Mimi running around behind it trying to figure out what to do.
Right. So Ari, I should have given a little bit of Cisco's background, which I didn't. He was the assistant to the mayor of Berkeley. He had a number of jobs in D.C. before that, and he is the CEO of Renew Financial. Ari, after going to Brown and creating something called The Invincibles, it is not an animated movie. It was an NGO to create job opportunities for 18 to 34-year-olds. He then helped run the Rhode Island Foundation, created a lot of jobs, and more recently joined Renovate America. So with that, tell us a little bit about how and why you got involved with PACE.
Great. Well, from that picture, I think everyone can understand. I got involved because I like cake. So I joined Renovate America in December of 2014, so I'm relatively new to the party. It all started actually when my wife and I got pregnant, and I was working at the White House as a special assistant to the president. And we started having a conversation about the need to transition out of the White House and move into the private sector, but thinking about how best to do that. And we came up with 3 criteria. We wanted to be part of building something, making sure that we were part of a team and family that we really respected and had that sort of same feeling that we did at the White House. And that in doing well, if we had the opportunity to do well, we'd be doing a lot of good. And around that time, I met JP, serendipitously, JP McNeil, and we had a conversation in Washington, and it wasn't at all about Renovate America. It was about your life's work and the impact that you have while you're here. And that was pretty compelling because it fit exactly with what I was looking for. And so after many months of conversation, I'm sure endlessly frustrating JP with all my back and forth, decided to join and move out to San Diego. And the criteria were a pretty narrow strike zone in terms of finding something that was a good fit. But I think I actually underappreciated the potential and power of what this is. Because not only, as Cisco mentioned, are we working to address a real market failure and bridging a divide that exists for many, many people and communities across the United States. But this is actually the process of building an entirely new market and a marketplace where all kinds of stakeholders, from small business owners to homeowners to local governments to the community as a whole, have a chance to win and succeed. And so for all of those reasons, it's been very affirming to be a part of this community, and so I'm just happy to be here.
Super. I did leave out he was the assistant to the President Obama for private sector engagement, just a small footnote in his resume. Next, we have Leela's Dreamy Eyes. I think you know who that is. Okay, but we've got a better picture of him. My favorite one is this one, which wasn't Photoshopped. That's actually him. So John Kinney, a serial entrepreneur in the wellness arena, in other areas, at energy. Now he's the executive chairman and founder of Clean Fund. John, tell us why. Why do you get involved with PACE?
Well, as you can see, I must have fallen on my head and have not been the same. I had, back in 2008, I had sold a company. I had several companies and had the opportunity to say, okay, I really want to get into clean energy, and started a biodiesel company, and got frustrated in that in 2008 when all of a sudden our customers were having a really tough time raising capital to buy from us. And we were selling biodiesel plants, not biodiesel. And I sold that and thought, you know, if I really want to change the world, and I really want to figure out something I can do with other people that have a like mind around that, I need to be figuring out how to enable all the clean energy entrepreneurs like my company then to sell great new technologies in the clean energy space. But I knew there was this valley of death where these great energy products and water conservation products would come to the market but wouldn't be able to get traction because they just couldn't get financing for their customers. And I was at a lacrosse game talking about this, and I was talking to the dad of one of our competitors whose kid was beaten up on my kid. his dad's name was Craig Hill. And I was telling Craig what I was doing, and Craig said, you know, I'm the financial advisor to Berkeley, and have recommended this crazy way for them to finance solar with a property tax assessment. And so I got introduced to Cisco and his team and heard about it, and I said, man, that rocks. That is such a great idea. How often do you have something that is such a win-win-win, where the energy entrepreneurs get to sell something, the home buyers get to buy it, the environment wins, the municipality wins. I hadn't even thought about banks at this point, and I think they win now as well. But in the process, Cisco's team said, well, we think this is going to be really big in residential. But Craig and I said, we think this is going to be really big in commercial also. And it's so different. Let's focus just on commercial. Let's see what we can do to get residential going, because if residential goes, all the municipalities will want to do things for their constituents, and it'll go across the country and then the globe, and commercial will just follow. It'll be easy. All we have to do is follow Cisco. So that's how we started.
We have a lot of stuff. That's awesome. And it's definitely the best photo. Mike Lemire. So Mike's background, another serial entrepreneur, joined Y-Green about 5 years ago. And I think it was clear he was going to be in the PACE industry because he got his bachelor's from PACE University. So with that, Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got involved and why you got involved in PACE?
Sure. So it was 2008. I moved here from New York. My one-year lockup at AIG had expired at a very timely point when AIG was asking the government for a lot of money. It's about a year after they bought my company. So I had moved to California to join my future wife and decide what I was going to do. And so folks told me, well, tech is too predictable. And of course, you're going to go into something environmentally related or clean energy related. I decided to dabble a little bit in wine and figure out which is another predictable path in Northern California. And actually was at a winery who was talking about putting in solar. And so the guy was showing me more the site for the solar installation more than the wine grapes. And I thought that was a little odd, but a little nerdy, so I was interested in that. Not too long after, I'd met Dennis Hunter, who was a successful banker and real estate developer in Northern California. And he was telling me about something Sonoma County was starting to do. And when I circled back to the vineyard owner, told me about the Sonoma County program. So I looked into that, and that was just getting off the ground. And that's obviously been one of the most successful municipal or government-sponsored programs. So I thought, wow, the mantra of doing good by doing good, or doing well by doing good, really resonated. And what was evident to me early on in those conversations, though, was the opportunity, much like echoing John's excitement there, to create a product, a company, and an industry, and do it all at one time, and recognizing that that is an exceedingly rare opportunity, perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that not only I've been able to partake in, but I think everyone here. And I've talked to a lot of my former colleagues, friends, associates around the world, actually. I was at a global firm for a while, and very, very few, no matter how impressive or how exciting or how successful the things they're involved in, very few have been able to say that. So I feel very fortunate, and that's how I got here.
And finally, Jessica Bailey. So Jessica had a career at Rockefeller Brothers Foundation. She then went to the Connecticut Green Bank and created the PACE program there. And she left that to found GreenWorks Lending, which is a new PACE initiative. And what I'd say is that's really not unusual. I've met a lot of people along the way. I don't know if Claire Broido-Johnson's here, but I mean, dozens of people where you'll meet and they're on the periphery of PACE, and you bump into them a year later and they're like, I started a PACE company. It's called PACE Equity, Bo Eggman. I mean, story after story like that, really fascinating. So Jessica, tell us a little bit on how and why you got involved.
Sure. So, Jeff, you may not even know this, but I learned about PACE from an email that was forwarded that you wrote to my boss back in 2008. I was at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund at the time, and I was running our climate change-related grant making, which basically meant I sat in an office all day long, and people came in and told me why their idea was so great, and they needed money to make it even better. And usually you schedule these meetings, and you sort of go into them knowing what the outcome's going to be before you sit down, because you've done enough of the pre-work. So I get an email from my boss that had been forwarded from Jeff saying, hey, would you meet with this guy, David Gabrielson? Jeff's a friend of mine. He wants us to hear about PACE. This might be something that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund should look at. So I did a little bit of research, and words like tax lien secured financing and benefit assessments, and my eyes were rolling back in my head, and I said, okay, fine, I'll meet with him, I'll meet with him. So I scheduled 30 minutes, and David comes in, and he's all serious, and he has his briefcase, and he has his pitch already of why the Rockefeller Brothers Fund should support PACE Now. And I'm sitting there very, serious as well, thinking, this is so boring. Why would I ever fund this? I mean, we were funding really cool stuff like, coal campaigns and cap and trade policy and really kind of more glamorous policies aimed at combating climate change. But David sort of got started and laid it out, and he had a background in public finance, which I didn't. And about 10 minutes into it, all of a sudden, I got it. And I realized what PACE was, in its essence, was a really effective climate change policy disguised as a small government financing policy. And all of a sudden, in the kind of labyrinth of political issues that we were in, where the Republicans weren't going to let you do anything and the Democrats weren't going to let you do anything, it seemed like PACE had sort of emerged as a potential path forward. So 10 minutes into the meeting, I was hooked. I told him, I think 15 minutes into the meeting, we're going to write you guys a check. This is really exciting. Congratulations. Let's get started. So that was really my first foray into PACE. And I got really into it with David, and it became one of our larger recipients of grant funding when I was at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. At about, 18 months or 2 years after I met David, I called him up one day and said, this is really exciting. It's just not moving fast enough. I'm leaving the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. I'm going to go up and work with Governor Malloy and the Connecticut Green Bank to see if we can actually make one of these programs work, because the policy really, really makes sense, but we're not actually seeing any projects. So I moved from the foundation world into the public sector world, where we put together a policy and a program in Connecticut to see if we could actually make real the promise of PACE, and that's what we did up in Connecticut.
Awesome, thanks. So, hopefully what you're hearing is this is much more than creating an asset class. This is a mission. And the early folks, the pioneers, many of whom are sitting here and a lot of whom are in the audience, didn't get involved with this to make money. That was not the impetus. It was change, social betterment. So, question I want to ask the audience, because given the numbers here, I feel like it has to be asked. Those of you who have been in and around the PACE industry for 3 years or longer, show of hands. Wow. Okay. Those who've just come to it in the past year, show of hands. Awesome. And that's not surprising. So the segment now, we got about 40 minutes left. We're going to separate it into little buckets. First bucket is going to be mostly focused on successes. Then we're going to move to challenges, problems, and finish up with future. Okay, so on successes, might kick off with John. John, what would be a project that you're most proud of, that you've been involved with Clean Fund?
Well, our first project, I guess, is the one that resonates with me immediately, because it was everything was new about it. It was back in 2010, and this was in Sonoma, which was one of the only counties where we could do this. The project was identified because the mortgage holder had said no to doing it. And so I thought, well, this would be a great way for us to show that we can make these work for the mortgage holders. And so I went up and met with the CFO at Cotting Industries, which is a real estate company that is investing in clean energy businesses. And told him about this, and he stood up and he said, "Wow, that's awesome. You can then go," and he recited what my business plan should be. And I thought, man, That's right. That's what we should do. And this gentleman turns out to be Greg Saunders, who is now our CEO. But the thing that was most exciting about it was that the mortgage holder consent. I went to the former chairman of B of A to help with the consent process, and he said, "This is one of the best ideas that has crossed my desk since I left B of A," and that really got me jazzed up. And he said, "But this is going to be so hard to do."
Move on to, is it okay? Cisco. Yes. What sticks out in your mind?
Look, I mean, the biggest one for me, we launched the first Berkeley program. We have a 40-home pilot. You saw the website go live. We sold it out in 9 minutes. And that was the moment where you realized this is happening. So folks had organized in the community, contractors, to get their, they'd hold breakfasts to get people to come in and apply to get in before it ran out. We literally sold out in 9 minutes. And that was a really big moment because for the company, of course, but really because it says this works in general. You can do this, people will show up. The thing that I would say the biggest piece, and John was a part of this, when I go back, one of the things I just love is a couple years ago, we did a project jointly on a child abuse prevention facility in Sacramento County that was in a world of, it was a great program and a great group, and they had a busted HVAC, and it was coming up on summer, and it was about to be the end of the world, and they did not have the capacity to fix this problem. And we were able, with John, to put together a small deal, financed it through CalFirst. They sent a letter to me about essentially how we had saved the organization. And this was an early project, and I think it was, as much as the Berkeley first launch was an experience, that one, I think, also really struck close to home because of what a big difference it made for a bunch of people.
Awesome. Jessica.
So I would say the success I'd want to talk about is what we did in Connecticut. I think when I left one of the cushier jobs you get, sitting in a foundation all day, to go and become a state employee, people thought I was crazy. A lot of people thought I was crazy. But the reason I did it is because I couldn't understand why we were passing all these good policies and nothing was happening. So really what the team in Connecticut and I tried to do was make it work, right? So how can we get policy that's going to work? How can we get a program set up that's going to work? And how can we actually get some deals done? Because that, at the end of the day, is why we're all killing ourselves. So within 2 years in Connecticut, we got 100 towns to come on board and say, yes, we'll collect these PACE assessments. We passed really exceptional policy at the state level, and we got the mortgage bankers not only to neutralize, but to become supportive. I'll never forget the moment we were sitting in a meeting like this, and the head of the Bankers Association got up on stage, and we didn't even know he was going to do this. And he just said, I'm coming out today with my strong support for commercial PACE legislation in Connecticut. And Brian Farnan and I think, were in the audience. We're like, where did that come from? But it was sort of this coalition that we built in Connecticut that just worked really well. And then, of course, getting all these projects done in the first couple of years, selling a bunch of them to Clean Fund, and doing a lot of the firsts around commercial PACE. Because when we started, on the commercial PACE side, it had been really slow, right? There just hadn't been the number of projects that you wanted to see. We used to joke, Cisco and I, that we wanted to go to conferences where there had been more funded projects than there were people at the conference. And I think we're finally crossed that tipping point, although this conference is going to give us a run for the money. I'd say the second thing that I'm most proud of, or the second success to talk about, was when I was leaving the Green Bank, everyone either to me or behind my back would say, well, the only reason they were able to do that is because they had this sort of government effect. They had the government halo. It was cheap money. You can do this in the public sector. It's not scalable. It's not replicable. They're not going to be able to do it on the private side, and we are doing it with GreenWorks Lending. We're gonna end up closing and funding more projects in our first year on the private side than we were able to do on the public side. So that for me was I didn't know if it was going to work, right? Like anyone who starts a company, you don't know if it's actually going to work, but to have the experience of, it wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just because we were a government agency and everyone looked at us as the good guys in the room, and the mortgage lenders were consenting because we were state employees and we could hand out that card. It works on the private side, and for it to work on the private side, I think, is really the secret to making sure it scales, making sure it goes beyond the borders of the few states it's in right now, and making sure it becomes the industry that we're all hoping it becomes.
Super. So I think what you're hearing and what you saw in the video from David is PACE is working. And we're going to show you a few quick slides on that. Well, I forgot this. So guess who that is? That's Mike Lemire. All right, and we have one other slide, which that's Jessica. And I'm not going to tell you who that is, but that is the children of one of the panelists, and he wanted to have that because he said ultimately he's been working on PACE because he wants to create a great legacy for their future. A few other little ones. This was the predecessor panel to this in '09 at the Milken Institute, where we started just brainstorming on, can this PACE thing work? And it was not a panel focused on how great PACE was. It was, can this work? And it was really fascinating, and it led to a lot of good stuff afterwards. All right, PACE is working. These are some slides to just show you the ramp, and I think we're all anticipating those trends are going to continue and accelerate. That's residential. Those are where the programs are funded, commercial. And then just a variety of, you can see the variety of uses of PACE. All right. Let's move to the next question. Biggest challenges that you've faced during your career in PACE. Now, we know we've got challenges that we're going to solve in the future. That'll be the next subject. But moments during your careers in the PACE industry where maybe it was hard to get out of bed, or you were really having self-doubt about it. I'm going to start with Mike.
I think there are too many challenges to count, especially among this panel and the room. Sticking with the theme I said before about creating a product, a company, and an industry, and what we've all been doing. I think, Jeff, you mentioned earlier the phrase asset class, and it's a new asset class. A lot of PACE, arguably most of PACE, is driven or is made possible by the availability of capital in an efficient and a scalable, a large-scale way. So, selling that asset class and helping create it, putting the financing structure in place to scale and do so in the hundreds of millions and now billions of dollar level, and then building the technology systems, the processes, recruiting and training your employees, building your contractor base, explaining this new product, this new company or companies, and this industry over and over and over again, the thousands of times, has collectively been, I think, the biggest challenge, and certainly has in the 5 or 6 years that I've been doing it, and I'm sure, and I've heard it reflected here and elsewhere. You feel like a little bit of Groundhog Day, except that there's like a whole calendar of Groundhog Days because there's that many topics within PACE that you have to sell and tell the story and over again. And but that's putting all those pieces together, starting from scratch, is the biggest challenge.
I think that's right. It's it's government, it's private sector, it's tax financing. It has been a mouthful, but it's getting simpler. Ari, you're the newest to this. Is there anything that sticks out in your mind? Took a job, maybe because it's in Southern California, maybe not. But aside from the location, have there been some times during your tenure at Renovate where you've said, this is a real challenge? I'm not sure how this is going to go.
Sure. I mean, this is, to Mike's point, this is, you're creating something new every day, and so it's a little bit of the drinking from the fire hose phenomenon. But I would answer that by describing a challenge and an opportunity both, because as one of your slides demonstrates, or a number of your slides demonstrate, there's an enormous amount of scaling going on in the industry right now. So there's demand for the product. It's a solution that works for lots of people on the residential and commercial side. And you have a PACE community that's gone from a relatively tight-knit group to a number of increasingly sophisticated players in the marketplace. And as that happens, you kind of cross the Rubicon a little bit of being sort of an under-the-radar enterprise and solution for folks to being, in essence, a financial product. And so I think the challenge and opportunity that we have now is to really define standards for the industry that help to maintain both that value proposition, but also the consumer protections that are frankly a requirement of being in a public-private partnership and working in the public trust. And so I think the maturity, the scaling and maturity of the PACE industry and the need to define and set and lead on industry standards from the perspective of consumer protection, I think is both the challenge and the opportunity that is the most important for the entire PACE community.
And that's great. We're going to get into that in a bit. Cisco, what about you? Any any existential moments during your time in the PACE industry?
Well, I've shared most of those with you, Jeff, so I think we've been down. Look, I mean, there's no. The easy one to come to, and it's certainly existential and miserable, was the FHFA announcement. And I remember calling you and saying, you know, is this, I just forwarded you something, is this what I think it is?
This was the highlight, okay, back in the day. Sitting in a room with Biden, and we were looking at ourselves saying, is this really happening? VP Biden says, use the word PACE. He said, we're going to use PACE to retrofit America. And Cisco and I were looking at each other like, this is unbelievable. And then, you know, 20 governors sign on, and then I get the call from Cisco, and he says, take a look at this. It's not April 1st. All right, so Cisco, keep going.
Yeah. Well, I usually only do this with beer, and it's too early for beer, so. But I'll tell you honestly, I mean, so you start a company and you grow it, and, you know, we're 200 and almost 50 employees now, and it's you know, there's a lot of great stuff, and every day is its own challenge. But I tell you, there was the time a couple of years ago where you could see the beginnings of what was happening, that this had turned a corner, and we were starting to really come out the other side of from the letter you just saw. Both residentially, but also the commercial world was starting to move in large part because of Jessica. And we were, you know, I was a company running out of money. So I think, you know, the reality of having to stick through this for a lot of years. In the end, it's made us, I think, as an industry stronger. It's made my company stronger. But there's definitely some times getting up in the middle of the night where you're thinking, I'm not sure that we're going to get through all of this. And you know, I would say those, as bad as that letter was, there's some many worse ones that came later on. Before we got to the inflection point.
I had visions of Cisco maxing out 30 or 40 credit cards during certain time periods about 6-7 years ago. Okay, let's talk a little bit about PACE residential, and going with what Ari mentioned, standards. So, you know, there are a lot of industries that haven't had standards, and it's led to big problems. And probably the poster child for that is subprime mortgages, where you have renegade people peddling financial products for people that are unaware, and it doesn't end well. So I'm going to start with Mike. What's going on in the efforts among the leaders in the PACE space to bring standards to the industry such that the PACE industry doesn't get tattooed with what I'll call renegade actors, attorney generals getting involved, et cetera?
I think two things are underway or have been for some time now, and that is, number one, the larger private firms, providers of PACE financing to residential market, Wide Green, Renovate, Renew, some other players have been working together, collaboration with a focus on you know, raising, tightening, and making more transparent the standards around how we communicate to consumers, how we market, how we oversee contractors, and a number of and many other areas. So that collaboration, even amongst competitive firms and individuals, is gratifying to see, and I think it's having an impact already. And then on the, I wouldn't say flip side, but related to that, you know, we're seeing you know, a real working relationship and a web that has developed and keeps extending on with their government partners. Small and large, and mostly on the smaller side, or the local side, I should say, saying not waiting for state or federal you know, oversight or regulation, but you know, strengthening the programs and ensuring that they work for the local communities. And so we've been really proud to be part of that in the community. You know, I think roughly now 200, 300 communities that we serve with, and you know, the other firms you know, work with. Yeah.
So free for all question. Should industry standards be agreed to by the industry, or should these be individual company decisions? And any of you can chime in with your opinions on that.
I think there should absolutely be a level, at some level of industry agreement, whether that's national or state or some combination, but there should be some parameters. I think there's room for competitive forces in the private side of the financing, but I think absolutely there should be an industry position.
Any other opinions?
I definitely agree. There needs to be a floor. And the thing to keep in mind, and it's very important to understand in the context of kind of the marketplace, is that PACE organizations are not bringing with them employees who are doing the work in people's homes. We are working with small business owners, empowering them and enabling them to do that work on behalf of the broader community, and using PACE as a conduit for executing the job. And as a result of that, when you have multiple competitors in the same community, if there is not a minimum standard in terms of consumer protection from an underwriting perspective, from a product eligibility perspective, from a financing level perspective, then what ends up happening is you have a potential race to the bottom that emerges, because contractors will go potentially to the least stringent or the sort of environment where they have the least obstacles to getting a job done, and that makes it incredibly important for us to kind of band together and ensure that there's a minimum threshold, a minimum floor that we can all build off of and improve on. But in order to create a cohesive and, frankly, consumer protective marketplace.
Now, Jessica and John, what about in the commercial space? I mean, because residential is the space of the greatest concern, where there are issues of particularly people taking advantage of the elderly. You've seen it in lots of spaces, and we don't want it to happen in the PACE space. Commercial is slightly different. You've got a more sophisticated buyer of the product. What are your views on standards? Should they be industry? Should they just be company driven?
Absolutely, standards are critical, and it sounds very cliche to say this, but PACE is the ultimate in public-private partnerships, right? So what people forget, particularly people that are coming into programs that have already been built or kind of structures that have already been set up, is the only person that can really make PACE sink is a local tax collector who decides they're not doing it anymore. And guess when that local tax collector decides when they're not going to do it anymore? When there's 1, 2, 3, 4 bad stories in their town about a building owner or a homeowner or some bad news story. It is extremely easy for anyone in any municipality, in any county, in any state to say, you know what, we're out. They have the power to do that. It's unique. Our industry is unique in that way, that we depend so heavily upon the public sector. And this is where standards become so critical, because without them, there are a couple of bad news projects that can spoil it for everybody. And so I would say, residential, obviously, there's sort of more obvious standards because you have models to follow. Commercial, it's a little trickier. Yes, we always say, these are the big boys. They should be able to make their own decisions. But standards are no less important, right? If you've got a small business owner, a lot of the projects we do are very small, $200,000 projects. These are, they're not homes, but they're not that far from homes. And the standards, the protections, making sure they know what they're getting into, making sure they're going to be able to pay you back, making sure their building can support it. These things are really, really important to make sure that the public sector stays on the side we want them to, because if they shut it down, it's over.
Okay, I'm going to move to PACE residential for a moment. So you saw the slide from the FHFA, which was a real existential moment in the PACE industry. There were a few renegades, and I think Jane Elias and some of the folks from Sonoma County are here, She was telling a fantastic story last night, which was when that letter came out, it was the death sentence for PACE. But the Board of Commissioners in Sonoma had a meeting, talk about this, and apparently there were contractors lined out the door screaming, "We want PACE." And Sonoma said, "We don't care what the federal government says. We're going ahead with PACE residential," which is amazing. And took some, chutzpah would be the best word in Yiddish. And then we have in the audience here J.P. McNeil, who had that same chutzpah. I got a call, and somebody was describing what this company called Renovate America was doing. He said, "Really, they're going forward with it? That's amazing." And he went forward with it with his team. And on top of that, they did a securitization, which was a tremendous catalyst for the industry. But now, given the growth in the industry, we are at a moment of deciding what to do with the federal government. So I'm going to open that up for the panel to chime in. And maybe, Cisco, you could start off, but I'd like some real dialogue. How do we solve this? I mean, right now, PACE residential is a senior lien based on 100 years of precedent, but we have federal agencies that don't like that and don't want that and can stand in the way. So how do we solve that?
I always got to come to me with this. This is, talk more about the success stories. Look, I mean, I think fundamentally, I believe, and I think that's generally shared, is that we've been operating in a little bit of the gray area in Washington. We have strong support. I mean, we can talk about the federal government's opposition. The reality is the vast majority of the federal government loves PACE. They're supportive of PACE. They understand PACE. They want to see PACE succeed in the residential and commercial markets. That's from the White House to the President of the United States, the former President of the United States, the Department of Energy, HUD. I mean, there's a lot of support there for it. The challenge that we face is coming to a final resolution with some of the regulatory agencies whose job it is to monitor risk in the mortgage system. It's not surprising that they've got to focus on PACE and that their job is not to balance risk against broader energy goals. It's really just to look at risk. So we've been in an ongoing conversation, many of us in the room, for years with Federal Housing Finance Agency, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and others. Yeah.
I ask you the hard question, because this is where the philosophical divide has been. Okay? The PACE purists, if you want to call them, PACE is senior. There will be no compromise. This is an assessment. So, Cisco, do you think that as a compromise with the federal government, are there situations where you think PACE residential should have some form of subordination or not?
Yeah, I believe that's the solution that we need to get to. I believe that's the solution that we're headed to. And I know as a PACE purist, for myself, it's a painful thing to sort of say we're going to compromise on something fundamental to local government tax powers. But we got to do it.
Ari, what about you? Where do you come out on this?
Yeah, I agree with Cisco. I think Cisco made an important point that is worth stating again, which is that when you're talking about the housing regulators, they might share the broader goals of environmental policy, energy policy, but they are housing regulators, and they are looking at ultimately the risk to the housing sector. And frankly, the FHFA, whose letter you put up on the screen, was born out of the worst housing crisis in arguably the history of the United States. And so I think as an industry, as we grow and scale, this is an opportunity to remove the risk for them, even though we can all acknowledge that it is vanishingly small, that these are high-level assets that pay very well. This is a way to, frankly, move beyond that impasse, which is as much philosophical as it is operational, and get to a place where the market can thrive and grow.
Well, it just shows how the industry has evolved, because if you asked that question 5 years ago, the answer would be absolutely not. PACE is senior, and until my grave, it's going to stay senior.
Jeff, I'll throw a little bit of twist. I agree that contractual subordination or limited subordination as a product feature and even as an element of policy, the way residential PACE is implemented has a place, I think a valuable place. My perspective, or our perspective of White Green, is though enshrining that in statute and subordinating PACE entirely below its current status that it enjoys fundamentally alters it and would build in some structural inefficiencies. To answer your original question about how would you, or how would we as an industry maybe approach the, unlock residential PACE or resolve that, I'd say do more of it. And the reason I say do more of it is because more of it means more data, and more data is what risk assessors, and that's what I did in insurance for years, risk assessment relies on data and experience. And so I think we've all heard that as one of the key requests of the regulators. But to my, to the point of whether you embedded a policy or product or at a statute, for instance, our book of business is only 30% affected by GSE-backed mortgages. So to implement for the other 70% of at least the market we're in, begs a question.
Thank you. So I want to just add a little footnote to that. When you hear the word subordination, it's not exactly subordination. For those of you who are technically adept in the PACE land, the PACE subordination that people are talking about is contractual, but it doesn't accelerate all the PACE payments. It's just on the past due, and the PACE assessments get reinstated post foreclosure. So it's subordination of really just the back payments. All right, PACE commercial. It was brought up last night over drinks. One of the fears is that if there were to be a compromise in PACE residential land, that PACE commercial existing lenders might say, oh, well, look what's going on in PACE residential. Let's do some form of contractual subordination in commercial land. So, Jessica and John, what are your thoughts on potentially the spillover impact into the industries you're helping pioneer?
I think the standards that we were talking about earlier are going to be different in residential and commercial. In residential, they're there to protect consumers. On the commercial side, a lot of it is to protect the banking industry and to drive down our long-term securitization expenses and create an asset class that's going to be larger and larger. On the mortgage holder consent side, the transactions are large enough where we can go to a mortgage holder and get consent. And there are other ways in a large transaction to mitigate the mortgage holder's risk. They can impound the property taxes. They can do other things.
And I think from what we've heard, on the big commercial real estate stuff, George Carragher is here. George, raise your hand. By the way, fantastic. A little round of applause for George. Hey, George. So we approached George, I'm going to say 5 years ago, because we had about 1.5 people at PACE now, and he was at Simon Property Group. And our view was, let's get a couple of the big dogs to do PACE, and then the other people will follow. And he fell in love with it and became really the first giant company to be doing PACE commercial programs, which is fantastic. So the big players have the leverage to get the consents. What we're hearing is that sometimes in the smaller player land, it's more difficult. So what do you think about this concept of subordination in PACE commercial land to grease the skids for getting deals done? Maybe Jessica.
So I think, Jeff, you put me on the panel because you thought I'd speak frankly, and I will. On the commercial side, the idea of starting to subordinate on the residential side is worrying because it becomes very easy for a commercial lender to say, hey, the government's not even subordinating. Why are you asking me to? And so we've actually had a pretty good track record of getting consent on these small $500,000 deals.
What percent would you say you've gotten approvals on?
I say we probably, of all the projects we've done, probably 15, I don't know, Drew, maybe 15% of them don't happen because of a lender consent issue. Okay. It's not meaningful. It's not, would I like to never have another lender consent conversation? You bet. But do I think the idea that we know enough about what the commercial side looks like in terms of securitization, in terms of what the capital markets need to say, hey, we don't need that senior lien anymore? I don't think we're there yet, frankly. I mean, JP put us $2 billion ahead on the residential side. We've got a long way to go on the commercial side before we're gonna have that amount of data to actually sit down with a rating agency, to sit down with eventual purchasers of an asset to say, well, what does it really need to look like? We just don't know. And so the concern is as the residential market starts moving towards a subordination piece at the policy level, at the kind of product offering level, that's fine. That's just, everyone's got to get their deals done. That doesn't worry me. But when we move into the policy level and we start telling states, hey, it's okay, pass junior lien PACE. We've never seen a junior lien commercial PACE deal done. We just haven't. It hasn't worked yet. And so I worry a little bit about kind of coupling those two things together and the inability to get consent if the federal government has said, hey, we're not consenting, and the world of PACE says, well, that's okay with us on the residential side. It just may make it a little bit harder to move as quickly as we need to on the commercial side.
Mm-hmm. We also think it's going to have a much bigger impact on the securitization when you're talking about commercial, with the concentration risks associated with commercial being so different than residential. It could really drive the costs up significantly in commercial, as they are in residential already. But I think that would really chill the market.
And I think there's other ways to protect a mortgage lender in the structure. So there's a massive difference between residential PACE and commercial PACE, right? We talk about them together. They are apples and oranges in terms of the origination strategy. I mean, you know this, Cisco, but in terms of origination, in terms of underwriting, in terms of financing, in terms of what the deals look like. The commercial side just doesn't look like the residential side. So I remember sitting with JP maybe 2 years ago, and he was walking through their app where they can literally underwrite a homeowner like in front of you. I was like, we will never get there on the commercial side. That the kind of the market for commercial real estate doesn't lend itself to the 15-minute underwrite. Where we can get closer to that, but we're never going to be there. So I think they need to be able to move fast. On the commercial side, we can take our time a little bit more, right? We can collect some of the data. We can collect some of the energy efficiency numbers that give banks confidence. We can tell an owner that, hey, you're going to have to escrow a couple of payments to get the mortgage lenders comfortable. We can explain to them the fact that it doesn't accelerate. We can do all sorts of things to make a mortgage lender comfortable on the commercial side, and we do that, and we get consent. But it just gets really, really hard if we're asking them to consent and saying, oh, but by the way, the Fed said absolutely not, so good luck getting this through your boss.
What I would add to that, and that's great, is PACE Nation, David Gabrielson and team are working on creating a database of all the PACE commercial projects around the U.S. as really a benefit to PACE Nation members, because we think it'll help the consent process dramatically as we give folks access to the database. Let's move to the next subject that different people may have different opinions on. Open versus closed PACE, okay? So there are some markets where only one player gets picked to operate in that market, and it's a monopoly. There are others where it's an oligopoly. And by the show of hands here earlier, there are a lot of new people involved in the PACE industry, and some of them pulled me aside yesterday or a year ago and said, hey, we don't think it's right that we can't be in that market. That XYZ firm is in it, and we can't be an administrator, or we can't be issuing, et cetera. So I'm going to open this up to the group to see what your thoughts are on open versus closed markets. Who wants to speak?
I think one thing that's jumped out at me as I talk to folks and meet with folks across the country is the different definitions of the word open and the different definitions of the word closed, and administrator in particular. So in California, kind of view it as a hybrid. We have closed systems, but an open market. We have joint power authorities in cities and counties that have one administrator, and that administrator funder has a lot of funders on the back end. We have almost 24 funders in our system. But
I want to come into a market you're in, Mike. I can't, right? I mean, if I'm XYZ Co. and I call, they're not going to let me be an additional player in that.
Well, actually, that's what I mean by open and closed in California, because there are JPAs that have an open platform that will take a new provider, and then the cities and counties can opt into multiple programs, so they're not closing off their markets, which is really the market we're talking about, right? The business that's being done, the projects they are in local communities. So we have closed systems where an entity might have one firm or a small group of firms, but we have an open market in that I think we have 8 or 10 or 12 or more, John, right? In California. So not say every state has to look like California, but we've obviously originated more. So I think it's part of it's what works for a state or a community, and part of it's just the evolution of the industry and the different structure.
It's hard. I think maybe we're going to rush through the last thing on future, then we'll go to Q&A. And yes, yeah, sure, go ahead.
I actually think, as a public policy matter, open markets are the right way to go, because that kicks off competition. Competition makes people better. That's a good thing. What's key is that you have standards, right? So it comes back to that same idea again, that the entrants in the marketplace are at that same floor, so that you have some consistency among the various options that are being made available to consumers, commercial or residential.
And I think that's where all the systems are going. I mean, we may have seen some early closed systems, but it's really, in a public-private partnership, the municipalities really can't keep competition out. And as the industry now is, look at this, and this is amazing. So I think the closed systems are gone.
I'm going to ask each of one last quick question, then we're going to go to Q&A for about 5 minutes. Would love to hear your view on a new market. It could be geography or a product, and what you think the size of the industry is going to be in 5 years. So just very quickly, new market, size of industry. John.
Well, one of the new markets I think will be the application of PACE on multiple parcels. So it'll be financing a smart grid, whether that's residential or commercial, virtual peaker power plants that are done in cooperation with utility companies and done on an elected basis. And I think the industry is going to, I think $10 billion will not be far off, and I think we'll be revisiting the name of PACE Nation to call it PACE Nations.
Well, I'll just give an example. 11 months ago, Governor Brown in California issued an executive order to have communities reduce water consumption by 25%. Up until that point, Renovate America had funded projects that were projected to save 400 million gallons in water over 3 years of funding. In the 11 months since, that total number has gone to 3.3 billion gallons in projected water savings. So I think what's going to end up happening is that at a policy level, communities and states are going to look at PACE as a vehicle for accomplishing complex policy objectives. Water is an example in California. The Los Angeles Times had an editorial on seismic and PACE a couple of days ago. States on the East Coast are looking at wind hardening for hurricane preparedness as a way for homeowners to get access to insurance. So I think that is an expansion of PACE from both geographic and product perspective. Ultimately, what I think that means from a market attainment perspective is almost limitless. I can't put a number on it, but I think the potential is enormous.
I think we're going to see a lot of evolution. I think this is all true. I think we're going to see a lot of small, medium-sized businesses doing solar projects because they've just not had financing before. I think PACE opens that door tremendously. But what I would say, when I look forward, we're moving to a place where the basic sort of centralized system of energy is switching gears to a very decentralized system. We've seen this in telecom. We've seen this in other things. And that means you're going to have hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars move into financing individual improvements on homes and businesses, as opposed to that investment taking place at a centralized plant basis. That PACE is the tool that gets us those investments. It is the key driver, a key driver towards allowing for a move towards 100% renewables, to a flexible, engaged sort of grid where you've got renewables, storage, home energy management systems, energy efficiency, demand response, all of those things linked together, the capital coming in to support those improvements, and the ability for a very different energy system that is much more responsive and much, I think, more tailored to individual needs. So when I think of PACE in the next few years, I say 5 years from now, what you're really looking at is PACE-enabled the capital that completely transformed our energy system and our economy, and I think that's, we're well on the way to getting that going.
So I don't do residential, but I would say on the residential side, my expectation is we'll see a lot of states pass policy. Once the federal government comes out with some guidance, they'll have the confidence to move forward. That would be my hunch of what's going to happen there, and that will expand beyond California finally. On the commercial side, I think we're going to see a lot of growth in this PPA secured PACE model. There's been a couple of companies, a couple of states that have been experimenting, including our state in Connecticut, of figuring out how to use that PACE structure to essentially offer a PPA to a non-credit-worthy borrower, right? So someone that they otherwise wouldn't be able to offer a PPA to. It solves that kind of credit risk, and what it does is it creates an awesome product for nonprofits. Nonprofits are wonderful PACE candidates because they often don't have great access to the capital markets. They're sort of a funky credit. But a PACE-secured PPA for them is a really ripe product, and there's all sorts of kind of mission-driven nonprofits, from churches to civic associations to others, that are looking at trying to upgrade their buildings, particularly with solar. And this PACE PPA structure, which is, there's probably been a handful of them done in the country. A lot of them have been done by the team at the Connecticut Green Bank. It's just getting started, and I think we're going to see a wave of that in the next couple of years.
Well, I can tick off a number of areas where I think we're going to see a lot of growth. I mean, Florida, while not new to Y-Green, I mean, we just completed our 2000th project. I think you're going to see other firms and other programs offered in Florida, and a new product to a lot of folks that haven't operated there would be the wind protection and abatement and storm resiliency. We've seen seismic, I think Ari mentioned, in California. I think on commercial, a lot of the focus, not entirely because the Green Bank did a great job on this, but a lot of the focus, the headlines are on larger multi-million-dollar projects. Most of commercial is $200,000, $300,000, $500,000. Mom and pop entrepreneurs own their own business, or their building. And so I think we've seen a great velocity there, and we actually at Y-Green combined small commercial and with residential into securitizations now. So I think you'll see that evolution to scale commercial funding at that small to mid-size level. But big picture, I think the revolution the next revolution that we'll all see is how PACE coalesces to become the dominant financing mechanism for home improvement, building improvement, and energy improvement across the country in a very disparate landscape for how folks pay for these projects. I think PACE is the one thing that has the potential to really be the industry solution in all of these sectors and really catch on fire.
I want to finish off with a few final things. So to keep on schedule, I would grab them after for question A. We're not going to have time for Q&A. I apologize for that. What I'd add to this is there's a reasonable chance that in the next bunch of months, some federal compromise will have been reached. If that's the case, I think this industry is going to be absolutely enormous, depending upon how it's resolved. I think we could all be sitting here next year and looking at absolutely extraordinary potential. I want to thank the early people in PACE. As Cisco alluded to, the early days were lots of ups and downs, and people have stuck it out. I look at Mahesh in the audience, and there's a dozen people like that when things were looking really bleak, they marched on. And a lot of great supporters. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Tilia, Kresge, NRDC have been extraordinary supporters during really difficult times. It's easier now to jump on the bandwagon, but 7 years ago, it wasn't. What I want to close with is, when I got involved, came up with this name, PACE Now, because we wanted to create a new asset class. That was the desire, and it's been really hard to do. But my personal opinion is the mission has been accomplished. So I first want to give everybody a round of applause for that. And what I want to close with is, given that the mission has been accomplished, as it might be clear, we're changing the name from PACE Now to PACE Nation. And what we're driving towards over time, this is going to be the membership organization, and I think we're most likely looking at the inaugural members of what will end up being the association for the PACE industry. And I know David's very excited, and you'll be hearing a lot more from him about that. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists, and I look forward to seeing everybody over the next day or so.